I've recently had this problem where I've been reading quite a lot, but I haven't been finishing many books. And since I'm doing research for a project, it meant that I'm sampling a lot of books to get what I need from them, but I'm not reading many books cover to cover. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but every once in a while, it feels good to just finish a book, to say that you're done with the book. And so I thought what I should do is just look for some books that I could read in a day. And I wanted to share those books with you too. These are some great short books that I think you'll enjoy. And the first book we are going to start with is Changing Planes by Ursula K. Le Guin. Changing Planes is definitely not one of Le Guin's most famous works. When you're thinking about Le Guin, you're obviously usually thinking about Left Hand of Darkness or The Dispossessed. And while she has plenty of other great works, I love basically everything by Le Guin. Changing Planes is probably not the book that you think of very often. It's essentially a short story collection, but there is a framing narrative. A woman misses her plane in Chicago, and then she finds some way to kind of shift realities, right? So changing planes, but these are planes of existence. And each of the chapters is like a dispatch from one of those planes. My favorite chapter in this is The Flyers of Guy, though sometimes I've heard it Guy, I'm not totally sure, about these bird-like creatures and actually about how some of them develop the ability to actually fly, but how actually culturally they choose not to. It's exploring themes that are very common for Le Guin about conformity, individuality, expression, and freedom. I have a very fond memory of actually listening to that chapter being read by LeVar Burton on his podcast. I'll see if I can find the episode because it's well worth a read. This is a great little underappreciated gem from Ursula K. Le Guin. We have a couple of sci-fi works or things related to science fiction on the agenda, so let's talk about those all up front. And this is Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers, Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. This is about 200 pages. This is a classic work of science fiction that has been ignored by a lot of people, including me. I've never talked about it on this channel before. And in fact, I only recently read it. I read it maybe a year ago. But if you're interested in science fiction, you need to read this. This is the inspiration for the film Stalker. And if that's not like a reason to read a book, then I don't know what would be. And it was out of print in English for a long time because these writers were from the Soviet Union. They're Russian writers. This is weird science fiction. You know, there's some science fiction that's just like big spectacle, big adventure. And then there's science fiction that's weird. I think of Solaris as a great example of weird science fiction. I haven't read Jeff Vandermeer's stuff, but that's another book that I would think kind of falls into that weird science fiction, at least from what I've heard about it. The Strugatsky brothers are weird science fiction. If you like a sense of atmosphere, you like a sense of mystery in your science fiction, you like when things maybe aren't explained too deeply, especially up front, then I think Roadside Picnic would be a great read for you. And our last bit of science fiction in today's video is this book from Octavia Butler. This is The Last Interview. This is nonfiction about science fiction. This says The Last Interview, but there's this little tiny subtitle, and other conversations. Butler is, one of my favorite science fiction writers, particularly because I love the parable books, Earthseed books. And she actually talks at one point about trying to write a third one and how there were too many problems, too many ideas, not enough conflict. She described it as too much furniture in one of the interviews. I love, though, to read books about people talking about their craft. This does not just have to be writers, though writers offer a kind of particular pleasure when they talk about their craft, because when a writer is doing it, they're doing it through words, they're doing it through their craft, right? A carpenter talking about their craft is very enjoyable, but they're working in another medium suddenly. They're working in words when they prefer to work in wood, right? With writers, it's the same medium. And in my experience, that makes for a very enjoyable read. There's also a foreword in that book from Samuel Delany, who is another one of my favorite science fiction writers, especially from that era. I think I've mentioned Babel 17 a few times on the channel. This book is about 175 pages, but if you look at it, it's formatted like an interview. And because it's formatted like an interview, it's not nearly as dense to read as prose. So this is clearly something you could read in a day. And while this does have her last interview, it's actually a fairly wide-ranging set of interviews from her career. So you can even see how maybe she changes a little bit over time as her work is received. She finally starts to get some recognition. She talks about many of her struggles. One of the struggles she mentions actually is how Kindred is kind of sold as a regular fiction book and apparently did really terribly when it first came out. And I think this kind of speaks to this weird genre that many of us love. I'm someone who loves a lot of different types of books, but I love science fiction. And maybe some of you have also experienced this. You get made fun of for reading science fiction. People think, isn't that for kids when you still read it as an adult? You see writers express this too when they're told, why don't you write something a little more serious? Of course, Butler, like Le Guin, I think is writing incredibly serious fiction, just doing it in fantastic settings. But still, there was like a struggle for a long time. And I think still to this day, some writers get treated like they're not science fiction writers because their work is held in such high regard. I think David Mitchell was like this, but he would never be put in the science fiction and fantasy shelves of a bookstore because he was nominated for a Booker Prize. But, read Cloud Atlas and tell me that's not science fiction. I want to take a moment and thank today's sponsor, Brilliant. Look, if you're watching my channel or videos like this, there's a good chance that you like to learn. And Brilliant is going to make it easy and simple to keep learning and to learn longer. They have short daily lessons that feel like games. So you're going to build up that daily learning habit and it's just going to be enjoyable. I was looking at some of Brilliant's courses and one of them caught my eye in particular, and that was exploring data visually. It's interesting to learn how visualizations can be used to explain data, to make it more easily digestible, but also to look at how data can be misleadingly presented. I think that's going to be especially relevant as we enter into a political news cycle where people are talking about polls and probabilities and all these sorts of things. Well, you can learn about that on Brilliant. And if you use my link down below, well, Brilliant is going to give you a 30-day free trial and they're offering 20% off a premium membership. So use my link down below, you'll save some money and you can try it for free for 30 days. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. All right, so I know many of you are interested in Stoicism, and I love Stoicism too, and I've made a lot of videos about it, and I think I've mentioned this one before, at least in passing. But if you haven't read it, I think you should read Lessons in Stoicism by John Sellers. The reason that I recommend this book is that I think it's important to make a distinction between ancient Stoicism and modern Stoicism. So ancient Stoicism had a weird metaphysics. They had a particular view of logic. They believed in the Greek gods, and they could appeal to providence, right, in a way that many modern Stoics can't because they don't believe in it. They don't believe in the metaphysics that makes providence make any sense. And so if you're learning about Stoicism, one thing you can do is read the ancient Stoics. I think that's really good. You need to learn about them. But then you want to read the modern Stoics and learn about how modern philosophers have kind of changed Stoicism based on what they think is true. I don't say any of this as a criticism of the modern Stoics. I just think it's a recognition of how ideas and even schools of philosophy develop over time. This explicitly is about how ancient philosophy teaches you how to live. It's even part of the subtitle. There are plenty of intro books on Stoicism. Massimo Pigliucci has written a good one, for instance. But I like John Sellers the best. That book is endorsed by A.A. Long, by the way, who wrote one of the best books on Hellenistic philosophy. I mean, that book is expensive and you can't read it in a day, but it's just one of the great books that will teach you about the Stoics and the skeptics and such. A.A. Long is a serious, reputable scholar. So if he's willing to look at Sellers' book and say that it's good, trust A.A. Long more than you would trust me, certainly. But that's a great book that you can read. And at 76 pages, really a book that you can read in a day. Another short work of philosophy is some of the more non-technical writing of Bertrand Russell. And this is In Praise of Idleness. This is really like a collection of essays. If you didn't want to read it in a day, you could just divide the essays up, read them occasionally. I think thinking about your relationship to your leisure time is actually a really important, I would say, philosophical move to make, or a really philosophical thing to consider. It's a philosophical problem because it's related to how you live your life. And philosophy, I think if you're thinking deeply about how to live your life, you're already doing philosophy, even if you wouldn't call yourself a philosopher. Plato, Aristotle, they're deeply concerned with this problem of how to live. I think when people think about philosophy now, they often are thinking about stuff that's completely irrelevant to their lives. What's interesting about Bertrand Russell is that he is one of the premier analytic philosophers. And many people assume that analytic philosophers, and this is a tradition I was trained in, are interested in logic and language and kind of puzzles in philosophy. And as if this is antithetical to being interested in how to live. Russell shows that the same mind can be thinking about many of these things. There's actually this line in Aristotle. Aristotle's clearly concerned about how to live, but he also says that knowledge of higher things, about necessary things, this is what he thinks is scientific knowledge. It's a little bit different than our science. That's the highest form of knowledge because those things are more noble. He says that in the Nicomachean Ethics. I think that Russell was concerned with many of those higher things, but also like Aristotle, was concerned with how to live your life. This is also some of Russell at his most political. So he's talking about fascism, socialism, communism, talking about it all. And I think many people overlook how many of these great philosophers who we don't think of as premier political thinkers, Russell, Carnap, Frege, had political thoughts, and they tried to think of them philosophically. Frege is probably the embarrassment in that group when it comes to that stuff. But the point is that these were deep thinkers about sort of technical matters, but they also were thinking about how to live individual lives and how to live our collective lives. Our last little bit of philosophy is going to be The Praise of Folly by Erasmus. A good friend of mine loves Erasmus and told me that I wasn't allowed to talk about Erasmus because he loves them so much. This is about 120 pages. There's an introduction and commentary in this edition from Princeton. I like the Princeton edition quite a bit, by the way. These Princeton classics are just really well done. Princeton University Press is a great press to look for. This is another one of those books that, even though it's 120 pages, you are asking yourself a lot when you read it. You're also just losing a lot when you read Erasmus in translation. You know, actually, from the dedication to Thomas More that Erasmus gives, that you're already losing things because there's a pun in the title in Latin between that and Thomas More. He's dedicating it to a friend. Turns out the title is a pun. It doesn't read in English at all. It doesn't make any sense. And so the difficulty is that if you know even from the title that there's a pun in Latin but not in English, how are you possibly going to find how funny this book is? Because it is actually a very funny book. The idea that Erasmus has is that it's insulting to think of heavy things, serious things, lightly, but it can be delightful to think about light things seriously. So he talks about folly, but he's like analyzing it seriously. But of course that's going to be funny. So it is funny even in English, but is it as funny as it would be if I were reading in Latin? Almost certainly not. I often don't stress about reading things in translation. You know, I like a lot of Russian writers. I can only read them in English. I read Aristotle in translation. I read everything in translation. But Erasmus, for some reason, is the one that bothers me the most. And it made me think like I should improve my Latin substantially so that I can read Erasmus, even though he's sort of the height of medieval Latin, or so I've been told. This is Plain Style by Christopher Lasch. This is a book about how to write better. It is basically Strunk and White, but updated and better. I think if you're serious about your writing, maybe if you're going to graduate school, or even if you are a serious undergrad and you want to learn how to write, the Lasch book is the best thing for you to read. Don't read Strunk and White anymore. It's outdated. It's wrong. But read Christopher Lasch. But it's also, I think you see a kind of spirit animating this text, which is almost Orwellian. Orwellian in the positive sense, not in the sense of being like the government in 1984, where he takes language seriously because he takes his reader seriously. It's similar to what Orwell would say when he describes the plain style, or when he's talking about politics in the English language. Great essays. You know, and Orwell's essays, by the way, you can't read them in a day. There's too many, but they're also one of those things that you should make some time for. Lasch was a gripping writer, just stylistically. You know, he's writing history or sort of cultural criticism, maybe philosophy, you could say. And so I would say if you want to learn how to write like that, check out Plain Style by Christopher Lasch. It's the only style guide for the English language I think you'll ever need. This last book just fits with the theme of my channel so much. So it's definitely worth recommending. So this is Breaking Bread with the Dead by Alan Jacobs. If you know the name Austin Kleon, by the way, he blurbed this book. This book is essentially about how reading books can make your life better, which might be the thesis statement of this channel, that reading books can make your life better. My big worry about this book, though, is that the people who would read a book like this don't need to be told that they should read old books. If you would read this book, you're probably already convinced that you should read old books and that they're good for you. If you go out and buy a book, I mean, this paperback is $16. If you go out and buy it, you're already kind of committed to thinking that it's worth doing, right? The whole project of reading. And so it's great to, you know, hear him discuss Homer or Le Guin. Le Guin's mentioned. Frederick Douglass is mentioned. So it's great to hear these discussions, but, you know, who is reading the book? I don't know. But sometimes it's fun to read a book that kind of tells you what you want to hear. And if you're looking for that, it can be a very pleasant read. And if you're kind of already on board with this general way of looking at the world and the way of looking at reading, then you should check out Alan Jacobs. This is not a top 10 by any means or a best of or anything. So if you have other suggestions for great short books that you really enjoyed, well, let me know down below. I'm sure we could have a really great discussion. I always love it when people are recommending things to me or just to other people in the comments here. It just makes the experience so much better. All right. Well, I hope you got something out of this, and I will talk to you soon.